welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. We are extremely excited today to welcome Glenna Gerard. Glenna and I have worked together, and that's been a great privilege of mine. I studied dialogue facilitation with Glenna and have really enjoyed kicking ideas around with her in all kinds of contexts. And Glenna, I'm really excited to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you, Boaz. I'm excited to be here. It's a new experience for me. I don't think I've ever engaged in a podcast other than listening to a podcast.
Yeah,
very
well,
nice. We are
yeah,
honored.
and curious to see what emerges.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe let's start with maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself. Obviously, I know you, but talk about your background a little bit and what's interesting to you.
My background is kind of like a patchwork quilt. I Until I was in my early 40s, I never lived anywhere more than 3 years, including kind of after I left home. I was born in Reno, Nevada, so I love wide open spaces and that kind of landscape. And there's beauty in like denser landscapes like in the southeast, but it's just different. I love being able to for the horizon to be way out there. And so that's something about me. I really love the spaciousness, and traveling through unknown territories. And that's true in terms of geography and loving the outdoors, loving hiking, rafting in the Grand Canyon, kiteboarding. All of that is important to me. And I love the same kind of landscapes mentally, and in the interior, kind of wide open. And I'm curious about always what I will find there when I engage. My dad, when he was 30, sat down in a church he was going to because my mom wanted to get married in the Episcopal Church. And he got a call. He decided to become a priest. And so he did. He went to seminary, and my brother and I, and my mom, of course, all went with him. My brother and I were like, 3 and 4.5. And then when I was 12, my dad decided to take a foreign missions assignment. So we went to San Jose, Costa Rica. We all learned to speak Spanish. I went to high school in Puerto Rico and to university at Columbia in New York City. And then I came back to the West Coast. So, which I left in 2002 to come to New Mexico. So when I think about me and kind of the essence of me, I said a little bit about, curiosity. I'm a kind of a lifelong learner. I'm always, even when bad things happen, I'm always asking myself, what am I learning from this? What's the message here? In terms of dialogue, which is, I came into contact with David Bohm when I was in my early 40s. And I think that's how he really inspired me. Because for me, what I guess I would have called authentic conversation, or just the ability for us as humans to talk with each other honestly and openly, has always been really important to me. Before I met David Bohm, I was actually a business manager within an organization that was a subsidiary of Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical. And in that role, I just always wondered, because the teams that I led were successful. We always met our objectives, but I just thought, what could we accomplish if we really could have all the main conversations in the room instead of out in the hallway? And what does it take to create that kind of an environment? And then I ran into the work of David Bohm. It was introduced to me, and I read a little blurb in a scientific article about him as a physicist. And in that little blurb, he talked about something called dialogue. And he said, just what would it be like if we could talk in this way? And it just, as I said, it rang a bell. And so I began to read about his work. And then I asked myself, so what would it take to help people to engage in this kind of exploration, a conversation where we really could make visible the way that we think about things, how we make meaning, and could begin to discern where are the places where there's like coherence in the ways that we're making meaning, and where are the places where there are disconnects. And so I became fascinated with that. And so over the last 30 plus years, that's actually been a key focus of me as Glenna, both in terms of the kind of work I love to do the most, and also in terms of just the way I work to live my life. And I'll tell you one more story that had to do with my dad around dialogue. And this I realized when I was older. I didn't know it at the time, but I have this very strong memory of when I was about 9. And my dad had recently, become a priest, because he did that kind of after he was a pharmacist. It wasn't what he was going to do from the time he was 10. And he was really deep into reading a number of the spiritual teachers in the world, like Ramakrishna and Yogananda, some of the saints in the Christian church. And he would give me books to read because I was a voracious reader, even when I was really young. And I remember one day walking over to him and saying, Dad, I don't get it. What's going on here? I mean, these people are all talking about the same thing when they talk about God, no matter, and, but they're fighting with each other. Why? Why are people from different religious and spiritual traditions fighting with each other when really their experience is about the same reality? Or so, and of course, that was, I couldn't really put it into words. And what I realized as an adult was that we have this experience that's definitely transcends our ability to understand it or to put it into words. And yet we must make meaning, and we must share it with other people. So we create a narrative or a story about that experience. And then at some point, we begin to think that our story is the experience, and it's not. And then we go to war over our story and who's got the right one. And it's just always been a really, really sad thing to me, because our capacity as human beings to make meaning is incredible. It might be what distinguishes us from other species. I'm not sure, because I don't know. Maybe dolphins make meaning too. Really don't know. But yeah, and what David Bohm had to say was, we make meaning, but then we say we didn't do it when something goes wrong. Oh, that wasn't really my idea. He said we don't, we're not conscious of what we're doing. So we make meaning and then we put it into the data banks, and it becomes just that, something that gets triggered by an experience. And so we pull that forward and we make decisions based on it. And they may be good decisions, or I shouldn't use good and bad. They may be decisions that are healthy for the well-being, for ours and also for other people's and other life forms, or they may be decisions that are unhealthy, and lead to pain and suffering and violence. So it became just incredibly important to me, that we learn how to create environments and conversations with each other where we can really say what's on our hearts and our minds and pay attention at the same time, so that we can see how we're creating meaning, and make choices. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I
So,
wanted to just set a little context for our listeners, um, and to rhapsodize David Bohm a bit because we have talked about the history of the quest for meaning and for understanding about the universe. And, we've talked a little bit about deterministic pictures and, the sort of different worldviews that people would roll up, philosophers would roll up to try to understand things. And in that course, we've picked out certain individuals that I think of as sitting at the crux, like
mm,
in this idea of an important crossroads, and they come to
mm,
represent almost major changes in worldviews.
mhm,
And David Bohm, I think maybe people know his name as a physicist, but I think at one point Albert Einstein said that he considered David Bohm his successor,
mm,
and that he was kind of a wunderkind. And
mm,
so, but part of the things that I found moving about David Bohm's story is that, here's a guy who I believe really did have the very best of all intentions. He believed in science. He believed in the
mhm,
march of knowledge, improving human lives. He wanted to participate in that. And then here he is, I mean, working with Oppenheimer and Einstein and Bohr and these people that were iconic within that arena. And then they create this horrific atomic bomb. And so Bohr, or Bohm rather, sits at this crux where science and the quest for knowledge all of a sudden meets morality and
mm,
ethics, and how do we relate to other people. And I think that posed it put Bohm in a different frame of mind, like realizing that there's something else going on here. Because what I got out of Bohm was, yes, it's about physics, but it's really about the mind. And it's really about how the mind tries to move in ways to understand reality, and the role that our thinking plays in that. So when he comes up with dialogue, this is not at all from a naive place. This is like from a extremely sophisticated understanding of this relationship between mind and form, or logos, and then the matter in the
mhm,
universe that it creates around us. And then to derive out of that an understanding of a new potential for human relationship through dialogue. To me, that story is mind-blowing. I mean, that makes him someone that really stands
mm,
out. He's not just
mm.
another soldier in the march of science. He really represents an aha for all of us. And I think he was really revolutionary in that sense.
Yeah, I don't, it's interesting because I don't know how many people see him that way. I, for me, hmm, you know, when I have read other scientists, right, some of them I think that I've encountered physicists, others like, or Einstein is another example, or Franklin Merrill Wolf, who was an incredible mathematician, and when they take their discipline like as far as they can take it and they keep moving, it feels to me like they all punch through kind of like a wormhole, and then all of a sudden they're in this other, they've reached an ability to perceive kind of this huge universal, unified field is what David Bohm would have called it. And I think they're in it. And then the way that they begin to see the world and the connections that they make, for example, around morality and right science, and they're just different. It's like gaining a perspective where we're able to see reality in a different way. And I think that that to me is really, that's what David Bohm was wanting to bring back. Now these are my words, they're not his words, but it's kind of how I perceive that, in terms of dialogue, creating an environment where, and using skills, being aware of the ways we pay attention, being willing to use language, because that's how we make meaning. That's what we do, right? With our words, that's a way that we create meaning and hence reality for ourselves. And being able to create or craft a conversation where we can actually make that visible, because mostly it's not visible. It's something we're doing all the time, but we're not really conscious of it. And so
Right.
I'm having trouble like finding the words, because
Yeah.
I think we're again trying to transit that reality, that they enter when they move through their discipline all the way through, and transit that reality of kind of the unified field with this reality of a podcast where we're using language to try to define and point to something that we actually can't put into words, not the words, because the way that words are constructed is limiting. So, and that's one of the reasons I think poetry, for example, is so incredible, because it points to something with words, and somehow manages to convey something that's beyond just the words themselves.
Right.
So I feel like David Bohm was inviting us to become more aware,
Well, and
of that whole process.
he's like one of the great thinkers in history that serves almost as a guardrail to kind of bump us back onto the road, because I see
Mm-hmm.
him as, we've given this example before on the show of looking at a record player and say a candle on a record player, and you see it going back, and people can argue about back and forth, but only when you get up on a third dimension do you see the record players going around, and that all that was like illusory. And what that was, I think, would be an example of what David Bohm might call fragmentation,
Mm-hmm.
because he was very aware that in the history, the march of our thought and the march of science, what we've seen in the past 100 years is all these new sciences, right? Well, what's the
Mm-hmm.
difference between psychology and cognitive linguistics? And right? And what we've seen is this fragmentation of
Mm-hmm.
understanding. And
Mm-hmm.
Bohm, his book was called, which I love, the first word, wholeness, right?
Right. Yes.
Wholeness and the implicate order. And
Implicate
so
order. Mm-hmm.
his sense of wholeness was juxtaposed to this experience, I think, of fragmentation that was happening in our world, but that it was connected to the way we think. And language brings out the way we think. And so dialogue's a natural place to kind of
Yeah.
maybe try to dance with this a little bit
Well, because language creates borders.
around
Right. And
things.
so,
And
yeah, well, so like when you look at the earth, right, from space, you see the whole of the globe, right? And David Bohm used to use this example and say, and then we have country states. They're arbitrary borders that we've created to organize things, to own things, right?
mhm, mhm.
But they don't really exist, except, I mean, we have made them exist and made them concrete. But and the same thing is true for words. Words are boundaries. They create boundaries. They describe different things. It's this. It's not that. And so, just like the record, where you say, if you once you gain another perspective, you see that it's going around. But this perspective down here, it's also real. It's one perspective, right, in a whole that has many different ones, just as we have lots of sciences which are ways of looking at what we are perceiving through a particular lens, and then another science looks through another lens. That's not fragmentation. Fragmentation is when we think our lens is either better than and or not connected directly to the other one, not part of this whole. That's the only thing that makes sense of all of them together. You can't see the sense from just one place. And that's one of the reasons in dialogue where we say we need to hear all the voices. And David Bohm used to say, we need the disagreement, because that's how we get to see the whole, is through all the different perceptions and the way that we're thinking about things, and trying to communicate what it is that we're experiencing with each other. It's not about who's wrong and who's right. It's about what's actually going on here. Yeah.
Glenna, I'm wanting to ask, I guess a couple of questions are coming up. So let me just offer one so as not to confuse things too much. So so I think there's a little bit of a paradox that what we're saying about David Bohm and the practice of dialogue is attempting to integrate. And I think integrating paradoxes is a common way that we gain insight or coherence through dialogue. And the paradox is words and language either create fragmentation or um, represent fragmentation that our thinking creates, right? One way or the other. But it's through words only that we can bring our narrative together with other people's so that our narrative can expand, so that we can learn and our narrative might come a little bit closer to representing the whole or reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so the paradox is we're stuck with words, and words represent fragmentation or cause fragmentation. Can you talk more about kind of, we're not trying to reject words, right? How do
Yeah.
words
Yeah.
take on this power?
I want to challenge you. I
Right?
don't think words create fragmentation.
Okay.
I think that um, because I look through three different lenses, and I see a different version of what's in front of me through each one of those lenses, that's not fragmentation. That's just looking through different lenses. But when I begin to say I'm right and you, Boaz, are not, that creates fragmentation, because it disallows, it disallows one part of the whole or one set of lenses. So I don't actually think it's the word. I mean, the words contribute because they don't hold the whole. Right? I mean, that's why we say there are things that are ineffable, meaning they can't actually be just put into words, because they're bigger than that. But it's really I think it's more our psychology and our that creates fragmentation, not the words themselves. Um, so yeah, it's interesting, and this brings, I mean, it brings forward another piece for me when when Linda Eleanor and I were working together in the Dialogue project, and we were, really exploring. We were kind of in the first number of years of exploring dialogue and how to create environments and help people to enter into this kind of conversation. One of the things that we incorporated in all of the work that we did was what we called nonverbal channels, meaning not words. So movement, somatic, art, painting, you know, imagery without words. um, and because we felt like that to some degree, the verbal channel actually, it's almost like it limits what can come through. Um, because it has to fit into the words that you have. And of course, you see this right when you learn a second language. When I learned Spanish, it was like, it is such a different experience to attempt to be in communication or sit in dialogue and speak a second language. Even though when I was fluent, it's different if you didn't grow up with the wiring that comes with that culture and that language. And so, the ability to translate what you're experiencing into some words to describe it to somebody else is not the same. And it so there's something about opening ourselves also to other channels that we can perceive through, um, that that helps to bring in more of the picture, more of the whole. Um, and but yeah, so it's again that question of yours. It's like, what is it that ultimately is creating the fragmentation? I think it's our refusal to see ourselves as inextricably interconnected, interdependent, um, parts of a whole. And I hate the word parts, but members of a whole, whatever, you know, small living systems nested within each other, but totally interdependent. And that we don't want to recognize that reality. It has
Well, we're
all
not
kinds of
wired for it, are we?
implications.
We're not really wired for that. I've been reading Bergson a lot, and he talks about he defines, intellect as a very pragmatic thing that's meant for manipulating objects in 3D space, and so the impulse to thingify things, as
Mhm.
opposed to seeing them as moving through time or as part of a flow, it's real useful. But he says that we see things like they had just invented the movie camera. So he says we see like a cinematological device or a movie camera breaking things into frames. And he goes into Zeno's paradox, how that's why it doesn't make sense, because you're breaking it into frames because we have this impulse. And he talks about how all through philosophy we can't escape that impulse to thingify things. But that's what I think what Bohm kind of represents to me when he talks about wholeness
Mhm.
and this idea of the implicate order, which I think maybe we could explain to folks, is that Bohm's idea was that the implicate order was sort of like the potential that the future would unfold as the implicate passes into the explicate. That is that the future is sort of mixed in with everything and gluing everything together. Because in physics, he had to explain non-locality, and
Mhm.
and this is like an impossible thing unless you really step out of the way that impulse to thingify. And so his idea is, well, obviously that's an illusion, the thingifying. Obviously, wholeness is the fundamental reality. And so I kind of see when I look, because I also, got pretty fluent in Spanish, and I felt like it was a different me. When I was in a Spanish setting and I'm relating
Mhm.
to, they call me by a different name, and I'm really coming out of a different set of. It felt like a different world in some set, but it was really just like this different linguistic cognitive model that had to overlay. And I feel like rather than, am I right or are you right? What I'm really trying to do is get that otherness as a way to, we've talked about this before on the show, as a way to fuse horizons, like as a way to
Mm.
really get to open to truth.
Mhm.
And who's right and who's wrong is kind of like this petty social thing that we all just need to get over.
Yeah, it's this petty social thing that creates world wars.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And yeah, it's well, so
But the fact
you
that
know
we
it's
see Bohm with the Dalai Lama and with Krishnamurti sort of tells you he's got an instinct that humans have a way to wholeness.
oh, and I think we do. And I think for David Bohm, the possibility of literally, in some sense, opening a portal, not in the digital sense, but, into that, to really kind of pass through to a place where we actually know ourselves, as interconnected. And we're at, where we live day to day, most of us is in the land of disconnected. We are individual realities. I mean, it's interesting though, because in some ways, I believe we know fundamentally that isn't the truth. It's a truth, right? But it's not another larger truth. And I think it's one of the reasons why, relationship is so important. You know, because in all the work that I've done with dialogue over the years, I mean, I have talked to, been in dialogue with people, and even now I find myself, I will spend like a Thursday morning in dialogue with this group and another morning in the week with this other group, or I hear about somebody who's doing something called emergent dialogue, then I get invited and I think, oh, I wonder what they're doing. Like, what is this? So I go sit in that. And one of the most common, the one thing that the majority of these different forms of dialogue have in common is this intense focus on relationship and really creating connection between people. And David Bohm used to talk about, if you sat in dialogue long enough, you would experience something called impersonal friendship. And to me, he was describing that recognition, or coming to recognize and actually experience a web of connection between the people that had been sitting and, in conversation and dialogue with each other for a period of time. And so there's a hunger. I think there's a real longing in us for to reconnect, we're already connected. So it's not that we're reconnected, connecting. I see it more as that we're energizing, those connections. And as we do that, there's a sense of belonging, and being heard.
Mutual
All of that
relevance.
is part of that world, in terms of relationship. And so I think the majority of dialogue practice in the world is really focused all around that relationship, creating those connections, energizing those connections. And I think that's an incredibly valuable thing to do, because if I don't see you as other, so much anymore, I might be more willing, to listen to you, and I might be less willing to support a regime that bombs you, right? So it's just something that's there, and what isn't being brought to the center in a lot of these forms of dialogue is this piece that I call metacognition, this piece of making visible the way we're making meaning, which for me is the piece David Bohm brought. That was the piece that was different, that really distinguished. And I think it's where that intersection, Brian, that you were talking about before, happens. Because I think David Bohm saw the implicate order as where everything is, but it's not in form. Okay. Although he might have gone even to the supra implicate for that. I'm not sure. But, so if you want to think of it as field of potential, then what comes forward into the explicate is what gets attention.
Yeah, and it seemed like for Bohm, like we've gotten in a hyper materialist reductionist mentality, we think somehow that stuff is real, but thought is not real. That's
Yeah,
just thought. But it
yeah.
seems like for Bohm, thought was extremely real.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and that like is the foundation of language, or that logos is the realness of that thought. I mean, it felt like that's kind of where he's going.
Yes, and remember, for him, thought was meaning making frozen in time. Thought was always past tense, never present tense. For him, the only present tense activity of the mind was thinking, and it was a much slower process
Mm.
than what he called thoughting,
Oh,
which
interesting.
was kind of like automatic. Um, so it, yeah, so it
It
just,
sounds like the difference between putting into language and cooking the content,
yeah, well,
maybe.
it's also kind of the difference between saying something that you've said many times before and only speaking when you know you've never heard yourself say that before, which is a really interesting experiment. I I wonder how much of what I've said I would not have said. So it's yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. Anyway, I'm not, you know, uh, I could go on and on and on because for me, I could play in what I would say is a conceptual realm. And for a lot of people, that can feel very ungrounded and abstract. And for me, it's not. For me, it's like very real and grounded, because what we're talking about is very much an experience of reality. Um, but I'm wondering, in terms of your listeners, and just what you're, if we want to make some
Well,
transitions.
I think there's more here, but what I was going to suggest is that maybe you could orient our listeners a little more in terms of, we've been talking about Bohm dialogue for the last
Hmm.
half hour or so, but we've touched on what it's like. We've said meaning making and metacognition and some interesting things. Can you introduce it a little more fulsomely to our listeners? Um, and then we can
Yeah,
jump back into the deep end.
yeah. Let me just talk just a little bit, kind of about my trajectory or my arc at the beginning in with dialogue. Um, so first, I want to connect why David Bohm really connected with me through even that one tiny paragraph where he was talking about physics, but somebody asked him about dialogue. And it was because he was talking about a form of conversation where we could actually reveal our meaning making. So, and for me, that's kind of what was missing. So, for example, when I said to my dad when I was 9, "What's the fight about here?" And then, when I was in my early 40s, recognizing, oh, that's what the fight was about. It was about the meaning making, and then that becoming identified with the experience that people were trying to share. So, um, when I first met David Bohm, because he used to come to the United States, he would to be in conversation with Krishnamurti, and he would come to Ojai, California, at least once a year. And in the last few years of his life, I was really privileged to be able to sit with him on weekends in Ojai. And he would do these weekend workshop kind of things. And there would be about 70, 75 of us that would be in the room, and we'd kind of all sit in this long oblong circle thing. And he would talk a little bit about kind of how he came to, his thoughts about dialogue. And actually, one of those talks that he gave at the beginning of the weekend is in the book on dialogue that's edited by Lee Nichols. And it's just a transcript of him talking about it, kind of from his perspective. So he would do this bit of introduction, and he would talk about why it was important, that we be able to really get a handle on what we were up to so that we could make conscious decisions. And he would say the only way we really can do that is by really being able to see how we're making meaning of things, because that's what drives all our choices and our actions. And his idea about how to do that was to sit in that circle, and after he gave the introduction, that was it. It would just be kind of like, okay, what's going to get talked about? So it would be, somebody would say something, someone else would come in, and that form of I don't know, actually, I don't think he ever called it that. I think it came to be called non-contingent dialogue, or some people called it emergent. There was no topic. There was no initial question other than what showed up in the circle.
I've heard you call that generative dialogue also.
I've heard people call it generative dialogue. Yes, that's another word. And always that was pointing towards, let's sit together. There had been this kind of talk that he gave that spoke a little bit about, what is this? We want to really listen, to each other. What happens when we judge things? He would talk a bit about that. And so he was, in some sense, doing what I call building a little bit of a container. And speaking from his intention about it. And then he would invite people to be in conversation. Well, that was really fascinating to me. It was also pretty frustrating, I think, to a lot of people. And it takes a particular, I don't think I want to go there. So that's what he would do. Probably somewhere in the second day, I don't know, I think people would somehow, there would begin to be meaning there was a bit more flow in what was happening. And I think overall, it was a satisfying experience. But, David Bohm was insistent. This is not about creating an outcome. This is not about making a decision. If you think about making a decision, or you're trying to reach an outcome at the end of the weekend, you will actually put blinders on your ability to see and to explore this meaning-making process, through conversation. My words, not his. So we would do that. So what happened was I went home and I was like, okay, I think this can be incredible, if it's what I actually hear David Bohm talking about. And I was here listening through the words he was using. But I really wonder, how do I help people engage this conversation in a way, give them a little bit of something more than just, well, here's this kind of thing, and this is kind of, and okay, now let's do it, right? So I began to think, well, what are the ways we can pay attention that help to create an environment where people feel that they can speak about, what they're feeling and what they're thinking with each other, and at the same time be paying some attention to what they're saying, not just sharing, but paying attention to it. So that was, the beginning of saying, okay, here's some practices or skills. And so that's part of how I tend to also introduce people to dialogue. And depending upon the group, and why we're, engaging with dialogue, whether we're inside an organization that is almost always wanting to do it to get to a better result, which David Bohm would have said, you can't do dialogue in that circumstance. And because of the hierarchical components. And that was one of the places where I didn't agree with him. I agree that it would be difficult and it's challenging, but from my perspective, even sitting in Ojai with 70 people and David Bohm, there was a hierarchy. And he was actually at the top of it, not because he wanted to be, but because we all put him there, because that's the culture, that's the meaning system that we live in, right? So that didn't really dissuade me. And I felt like working in organizations was one way that potentially could have a lot of leverage, because there were a lot of people, they were there, spending a whole lot of time in those organizations. And the organization could pay to introduce them to this form. And if nothing else, they would have a different option in terms of how they communicated with each other and with other people, and maybe even with their families. So it felt like a high leverage kind of an activity. So that's what drew me into that setting and into continuing to develop how do I help people create the container? So how, rather than me talking just about the container, what are different kinds of activities we could do together? Because I really believe people know what they need to pay attention to. They know how, they know what it is to have a conversation where people listen deeply, and and actually just set their judgments aside temporarily in order to be curious about what somebody else is seeing and how they're understanding the world. And so I would just, some of what I do sometimes with groups is just ask them. So here I'm going to describe a particular kind of conversation to you, and I want you to come up with what are the things that are needed in order to create that. And so we would create a container around that. And then, yes, I would introduce very specific skills and ways of, perhaps some new ways of thinking about what listening is. And also, there was always the component of learning how to notice our judgments, put them aside, get curious, ask questions, and notice our assumptions, because our assumptions they're like the periodic table of how we make meaning. um, I don't think I've ever used that particular metaphor before, but it actually rings true, because they're kind of like key elements in the way that our meaning, unfolds and the way we make decisions. And so it's really important that we be able to identify them.
And to add elements.
Yeah. So, and how we put them together, and and hence what conclusions we reach, and then hence what decisions we make and what actions we take and what results we get. So, Chris Argyris's work actually with the ladder of inference, which I've actually just described in different words, and how we take data and move through different steps in our meaning making process. It's one way that the corporate world can really understand the value of the metacognitive aspect of dialogue. They already get the relational, value, but the metacognitive piece is a little trickier, So then they're like, so how do you have a conversation where you actually can see meaning, suspend judgments, be curious, perhaps, experience that kind of portal opening where you begin to see things in ways that you've just never seen them before. You gain a different perspective. You get on top of the turntable instead of at the side of it. That can happen now, so anyway, so that's some of how I found David Bohm and kind of the evolution of what was really important to me in terms of, just numerous ways, that I continued to seek over the years to introduce it to people in different contexts and also to help people see the relationship between being aware of their thinking and how they talk with each other, also their relationships, their connections, and the results that they get, because that's key within organizations. But the other thing that's key is if you want to gain a perspective that you haven't had before, you have to let go of outcome temporarily. Because if you don't, it will keep you inside the box of your current meaning making and your current assumptions, and you will not get out of it. So you will not have a perspective that you've never had before. So it's really important that you create that space and that container for the dialogue without the outcome in the middle of it. And then after the dialogue, you can harvest your insights and take them to a conversation where you're going to talk about decision making. Um, so that's a really critical piece. And I think without that, it's one of the reasons why dialogue didn't ever really gain ground in organizations. Um, Not in the way that it could have. It was one of the issues. Um, you still can have a great conversation. You still can build better relationships, but if you're not looking at how you're making meaning, you get some benefit, but you don't get the whole you don't get the whole thing.
Sure. Now,
Yeah.
see, and my reaction to that is, it's related to something that I've said many times, and will say again because it bears repeating, and that is that in the Western world, we often conflate or confuse propositional knowledge with dispositional knowledge, and
And
so,
say what the distinction is, Brian, for me.
well, the 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 approach of propositional knowledge is to say that I can make truth claims, and I'm going to give them to you
Oh,
propositionally,
okay.
and then you're going to be able to validate them or not validate them. But the great
Okay.
example of dispositional knowledge, I always think of Chuang Tzu and the wheelwright,
Mm-hmm.
where the Prince Juan is sitting on the porch and he's reading the words of the ancients, which is of course propositional knowledge. If you can write it down, it's propositional. And the wheelwright is out in the courtyard making a wheel. And he says to the king, "What you doing?" And the or prince, and the prince says, "Well, I'm reading the wisdom of the ancients." And the
Mm-hmm.
wheelwright says, "Oh, pshaw. The wisdom of the ancients died with them, and what you're reading are the droppings that they left behind." And I
Mm-hmm.
think that they'll say the chaff or something, but I think it was like animal droppings because they're left behind the animal as he goes. And of course, the prince doesn't take wisely or happily to this. He says, "You better explain yourself." And he explains it by basically saying, "I'm 70 years old and I make wheels my whole life. And now that I'm 70, I make really good wheels. But, it's tricky. You can't have the spokes too tight or too long. And even though I could explain it to my son, I couldn't. He's going to have to do it and really learn
Mm-hmm.
to make good wheels." And I guess I feel like Bohm was swimming in. First of all, he was like such an intellect, such a mental power, and then he's brushing along with all these people that are just pushing thinking to Olympic levels. And, Spinoza says anything that's rare and excellent is difficult. And so
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we're kind of trying to learn how to gain some of that dispositional knowledge that these real, I mean, I can imagine the conversations that physicists would have when they're really wrestling with a problem and they all sincerely want to see it and they know they need a new way to look, or
Mm-hmm.
they're all stuck together, and they know that if they filter it from what they already think, they're only going to get what they already think, which won't solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
you get this like focus of genius on this idea. And I think he glimpsed this process that maybe all of us with effort, I feel like I was really blessed by some teachers that that in dialogue had this ability to sort of demonstrate a way to think and not just take things apart but put them together or turn them around, or a way that could model a free thinking, open, unfiltered approach to things, and that you kind of get the spirit of the thing from them, as well as understanding that, okay, well, you just don't want to do this or that, but it's more of the flavor of things. And that's what I mean by
Yeah,
dispositional knowledge, is that
yeah.
there's a kind of a genius there that we're just kind of trying to get just a little taste of how that works.
Well, and I think there's more than thinking. I think there's because I when I listen to you, what I'm hearing is transmission. That like some of the great teachers who have lived, who have experienced, who have and they actually embody
Yeah, yes.
this wisdom, which may get spoken through words intellectually, but that's not all. So when you sit with them, you receive a transmission, and the words are only a very small part of what's coming to you. I do believe that you receive it. Now, can you actually act on it and go out and make the wheel? No. Can it influence kind of the ground of who you are and and how you move forward in your life? Absolutely. So yeah, so I'm not. I mean, I'm not sure kind of what the. I'm not sure where we're navigating right now. Because I think one thing was we started out with kind of talking in a way that actually was pretty expanded and expansive and conceptual and
Mhm.
lovely play from my perspective, and very real. And then, Bo, as you asked the question about, well, what does this kind of look like, right? And how do you talk about it with people? How do you, what are some of the things that are important to be paying attention to? How does that translate into an organizational environment? And without giving a workbook, I've I've been trying to kind of talk to the threads of that, um, and um, and so I'm wondering kind of what's next. I mean,
Yeah.
in how
Well,
would
I
you
think
like to weave, or where else would you like to go?
what I was pointing at was just that it seems like it's more than just techniques, that
It
it's
is. It
actually
is.
something that has to shift in a perceptive condition somehow. So that's, I guess, what I'm
Right.
trying to point at, is just that,
Okay.
and it really is about the mechanism that we experience and communicate through. And that's a tall order to just go in and say, okay, we're gonna turn this on. Um,
Well, yeah. So it doesn't happen like that. I mean, I think that when I've gone into, let's say, an organization or to work with a team, right, um, and I mean, I will talk to them about it not being a one-time deal. Sometimes it is, and always, I've never had an experience where people don't say, "Wow, that was a different kind of conversation than I'm used to. That was great. I wish we had more conversations like this." So that's like level one in some sense, right? Because what they are so used to is basically David, discussion, percussion, like I'm right, you're right, so so for a while, they're bringing forward their curiosity and they're listening, and maybe they're also starting to talk a bit more about the way that they think about this problem, and why they think that way. Like, how did they get there to that conclusion? And they kind of begin to unpack that, which is not something they normally do. Um, so that is very useful, right? And so there's comments, about that. if groups continue to have, to have more conversations, use some of those same guidelines, then they begin to, the probability increases that that portal is going to open at some point, and it's always going to be a surprise. It's going to be a delightful surprise for people. It's like, whoa,
Mhm. And
you
they've
know,
caught the scent on the wind, and so now they kinda know have an instinct to how to follow maybe, or hotter, hotter,
yeah,
colder, colder,
yeah, yeah. They
maybe.
know kind of like there's something else going on here, and they know they've created that together,
Right.
through the
And
way that they're engaging and talking with each other and the way
and
they're
David
paying
Bohm
attention.
I'm sorry, but David Bohm, he really believed that was the unfolding of the implicate order when we get something new out of that, didn't he?
I,
I
I
mean, would you say that?
I think he believed life was the unfolding of the implicate order, quite
Well, of
frankly.
course.
But but I but and that what came forward depended upon what we paid attention to. So yes, that kind of an experience where people, I think what happens is people begin to experience themselves thinking together, not like a bunch of collectives, but actually a being that's thinking together. And I'm sitting in the circle and I'm having a thought that I want to put into, to offer into the circle. And the person across the way speaks to the same thing. And I have no need whatsoever to follow them with my version of that thing because it's already in the circle. And the fact that I might have said it in different words makes no difference whatsoever. There's no attachment to I had to say whatever this thing is. That's a sign that there's this collective being that's beginning to be there, and it's changing the way people are experiencing and the way they're communicating with each other. Um, so that does happen. Now, the other thing that happens, though, just in being truthful and honest about it, is that if you continue to be committed to look at your assumptions and how you're making meaning, you will run into things that don't work, that you're very attached to. And so, unless you're willing to let go, of those things, you will, you, there'll be like a backlash um, type of response to the dialogue, right? It's almost like the system that exists is saying, oops, there's something foreign happening here, and it's threatening the way we think about ourselves, and who we say we are. And so antibodies, get busy, get rid of this. So, so, so that also happens. Yeah, and it's totally understandable, you
A
know.
self-corrective function.
Yeah.
So, along the practical lines, I like to try to dance with how do we make the outcomes that are possible with dialogue higher probability. And what I find when we practice dialogue, Glenna, is
Mm-hmm.
that there are some patterns that I've noticed. So there is this kind of propositional knowledge, to use Brian's
Mm-hmm.
phrase, where we can kind of develop a nose for how how it feels when the portal might open and how to create space for that or something like that. But I
Mm-hmm.
think there are also some tools. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, for example, earlier I mentioned if we keep an eye out for paradoxes,
Mm-hmm.
then we might recognize the opportunity to change our thinking so that the paradox can be integrated. So there's like a portal to the portal. When we see a paradox, there's a portal to the portal. It's like in the Matrix when the black
Mm-hmm.
cat um,
Mm-hmm.
crosses a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Another one that I've noticed that you and I don't think have talked much about yet, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it, is that in our dialogue group, we've got a bunch of really smart, competent consultants that come with all the frameworks in the world and
Mm-hmm.
and use them well, are practiced in using frameworks. And sometimes we see frameworks meet and we use this framework to apply that framework, and that can give us a leap. So for example, one framework that I love to use and that opened the door to my interest in dialogue is Ken Wilber's four quadrants. We've talked about
Mm-hmm.
this, right? So there's the internal and external along one axis, and the individual and collective along the other. And dialogue is the only tool I know of that works on the collective internal quadrant and gives us access to that aspect of an organization.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when we take that framework and take Larry's polarity framework and kind of mix them together or use one to view the other, we suddenly have potentially a quantum leap in how we're viewing the emergent, what you know, or the topic, or what have you. So I'm curious what reactions you have to these kinds of um, tools, maybe, and what other tools you might offer, or do you think this rabbit hole of tools is not a useful direction?
I think, okay, so language, okay. When I hear the word tool, I think about screwdrivers and okay, and so that's kind of the energetic for me of tools. They're very practical, they're very useful, they have very specific ways in which they can be used. Although you might say, well, I could use a screwdriver for something it wasn't initially intended for, and still it would be useful. That's true. Um, and then I think, there are models. This is a distinction I learned from a teacher of mine. There are models that are kind of like a two-dimensional representation of something that help people image something. And then there are what my teacher used to call frameworks. And frameworks are something that as you move through the framework, um, the whole experience becomes potentially four-dimensional. It's changing you as you're moving in the framework. Tools don't tend to do that. Um, so when you talk about Ken Wilber's integral quadrants, um, that, what that does is give you a reference to whole, right? So, and most of our organizations tend to hang out in the two external quadrants of individual skills and tools on the top, right? And budgets, strategies, P&Ls on the bottom in the group, and rarely go into the interior. And it's one of the reasons why so much of what's on the outside, especially in the bottom quadrant, doesn't work or works very incompletely. But at any rate, I think it opens the possibility of perceiving the whole, that particular framework. So as you navigate the whole thing, you begin to pull in all these other dimensions of who we are. So then if you take something like polarity or paradox, which is a polarity usually, it's well, that's not always true. I don't want to get into the detail of that, but still, when you take things like that or conflict, David Bohm used to say that's and Arnie Mindel's process work used conflict as a very powerful framework for being in the whole and gaining different perspectives and being able to integrate different things into our view and our experience of the whole. Then those particular two, first you've opened the whole, then you bring it, if you bring in a paradox or two polar things that look like they're irreconcilable, and you've opened the lens or the ability to look from the whole, you recognize that you never resolve paradox. The tension of paradox and the opposition is only part of where we're standing and looking from. It's not inherent in the two energies at all, right? But when you have a framework that enables you to look at that paradox from the whole, then things change. So I guess, and I think that's what is the guy's name? Barry, what was his last name, who did all the work with paradox? And he also has a 4-quadrant system that he works with paradox with. At any rate, that when you're working a framework that as you work it, it literally shifts the way that you are perceiving reality. I think that's one of the things that can help a group to move in that way. And sometimes there may be combinations that really go together well. But I think the danger is if you start getting into the analytic thing. Okay, we're going to analyze with this. You can actually banalize, that's what my teacher used to call it, kind of banalize the power of the framework, because you move it from 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional to 2 or even 1 with the analysis. And then you lose the portal, right? So rather than activate it, right? So I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah. That I really liked the clarification about what these words like tool and framework mean to you, and model. And I'm excited to kind of be more precise about how I use those ideas in the future. I'm wondering um, if there are other ways that you think about improving the chances of success in organizations for the use of dialogue, or what are your expectations? And if you're going to do 10 sessions with a group, I imagine you're not expecting the portal to be open a majority of the time, but there are other useful outcomes.
Yeah, so at kind of level 1, there's the outcome of it's like team building in a sense. People learn how to communicate more effectively with each other. They learn how to listen, to be curious. They will get better results. They will make better decisions, because by virtue of learning to do that, they're actually bringing in more information that will inform and shape whatever decisions they make. So, and I think they also, there's also a next level where they begin to be able to not resolve conflict, but actually use it as a doorway, to again see more of the system. Arnie Mindell used to say conflict is a signal that something needs to move in the system. So it's not that there's a right or a wrong. There's something stuck. And so he saw his work as by enabling people to engage with that conflict in the system, to then begin to enable a flow to reestablish itself, or movement to happen. And I think when people begin to see conflict as a source, a resource, actually. Um, that does require them being skillful, and of course it requires them to be able to witness and not to be in judgment and attachment. Um, there's a whole lot of things that then happen, not only in terms of what people can see, in terms of, and how that influences their ability to think together, but also there's a huge influence on their relationships. So that can happen. When I have gone into an organization and been able to do work with a group of people, like a departmental team, over a period of sessions, it's always with the intention that they will use the dialogue, practice the skills for their day-to-day, to engage with their day-to-day challenges. And they will, in the process, learn to facilitate their own dialogue. In other words, I'm not necessary. So in the beginning, I do facilitate because it's within our culture, it's too radical for the facilitator to say, here, this is your job, right? um, but that's where they need to go. They need to not be dependent upon another person, because when we do that, we shift the burden of responsibility and we shift it inside ourselves, and then we don't do the work that's needed to develop the kind of listening and curiosity and assumption identification that's going to take us to a next level. Yeah.
So
So, yeah.
what this is bringing up for me, Brian, is the connection to the conversations we've had about Levinas and phenomenology, and how encountering the other is necessary to experience the infinite, and what Glenna is calling kind of how we relate to deep listening and judgments and assumptions and witnessing has to do with not totalizing, right?
Mhm.
So
Exactly.
I was wondering if you were kind of landing in the same place and what's coming up for you.
Yeah, the whole I guess the thing that I keep coming back to is this happening in a work environment, and that that might make a challenging context, and at the same time, it seems like maybe this is really the place that needs transformation, and that somehow maybe sincerity becomes the foundation uh, for recontextualizing work relationships. But for Levinas, and I guess it also, which we haven't talked about, is a sort of an ethical responsibility that shows up in Levinas that we haven't talked about, and that is that I sort of I have almost a metaphysical obligation to discover the relevance that this other person has for me, and
Mhm.
therefore it's like I'm not furthering my own philosophical growth if I don't police my own assumptions and don't hold my own feet to the fire in that way that sort of brings us to that place, and so that it really has a moral kind of a component. And I guess I feel that there is an ethics, maybe an unspoken ethics to work relationships that
Mm.
that we expect a kind of a sincerity that we bring to it, and that we yeah, that well, and this is, I guess, I'm a great one for the idea of setting examples and having so the people that I would want to have this training with first would probably be the board of directors. and and then let it trickle down through by example, and because there's a thing that's happening, not just we're here at work and we're trying to get better numbers, but that like
Hmm.
this is like a big part of our lives, and we're spending a lot of our lives with each other doing this thing. And shouldn't that be the pithiest? Shouldn't that move us along the course of our lives as much as it can, instead of just being something that we do so that we can buy lunch? And so that like I'm uh I mean, I guess it's a different take on work-life balance because I don't see a difference. I've never seen a difference between work and life. Maybe that's been my
Hmm.
problem. But I guess I'm looking again. It's this idea of fragmentation and reintegration and wholeness, and us together unfolding a future by what we choose to give attention to. I mean, that's all just bullseye, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And no, I find it all fascinating, and I guess I feel like in our time of hyper novelty, and with these new technologies that are enabling us to connect in all these different ways, that it's like this is the kind of work that's really thrown at our feet, because we have so much to resolve, and yet now we have, like, the clues are here, the pieces are here. Some of these luminaries have dropped the clues for us, but we have this due diligence, like we say in the Chinese classics, even though it is our inheritance, we still must strive to attain it. And so I guess I kind of feel like all of that is all wrapped up in there, and that we tend to fragment it into, okay, this is a thing that's happening at work. So I'm going to bring my work self there, and I'm going to put on my work mind. And I just don't know how much future there is once I've gone through that process. And I'd really like to open up what's going on in our relationship to our work, and
Hmm.
how it does us as we do it. And so
Hmm.
relationships in work, that's just huge and enormous, and feeling responsibility to the isness of our humans, in our setting. Like
Right.
that's just fundamental to me. And and I don't tolerate a work environment. Now I'm retired, so but I won't tolerate a work environment that doesn't show a certain amount of respect to who I am.
Hmm.
And maybe that's a part of that sincerity that I expect to be shown when I bring it to that place. And and I just see that challenged in a lot of work environments. And so I see this as really, not just a breath of fresh air, but a chance to repithify work in a way to add dimension that humanizes it somehow. So that's where I go from Levinas,
Hmm.
is that there's a really big moral component, and an unfolding of who we are in this, the infinity of ourselves and others.
Yes.
So does that make sense?
Well, and as you're
Yeah,
talking, I'm thinking, well, this just if we just think about there are arenas or territories, right, in our meaning making world. And the huge one is work. Another one is family. Another one, so right. So, you know, it's like in our culture, what is work, right? And what are all the assumptions we hold around it? What are the all of that is all about the meaning that we've created over years and years and years, right? It's evolved over centuries, but of work and what is work, and there's all kinds of assumptions and expectations that we have about not actually being a place where we bring our whole being. And of course, now in the last, 25 years, maybe 30 years, the workplace is more and more talking about we want you to show up with your whole self, right? Of course, there are also a lot of subtext to that.
a lot.
That, accept this piece here, or don't talk to that VP that way, or, right? So there's all kinds of power stuff in it as well. And but yeah, it's, and that, I mean, that was a question for me too when I began to do some of the dialogue exploration within organizations, was the recognition that yes, those hierarchies exist. Does that mean it's not, because I can't change that whole thing overnight, that it's not worth doing, that introducing people to this? And of course, my choice was no, that's not what it means, because this change, could create kind of like epiphany moments for some people, shifts in how people feel about their life, about work, about their family, whatever it is, right? But it could, but the work, this kind of work to me, it feels so huge. It's like my life is like a second in time. I'm not going to change the world. And yet I am changing the world, right? That's one of the amazing paradoxes that I had an experience around, when I was 30. And it's just, because I exist, everything in the universe is different. And if I stop existing, it's really not a big deal. And they're
I'm
both
not sure
true.
that's possible,
I think,
really, but
well, yeah, there's another conversation. Do we ever
yeah,
stop existing, or do we become part of the super implicate
yeah,
order
I,
and come back
I
out?
exactly.
want to
Anyway,
stay with
Bones wants to say
organizations.
something.
I want to stay with organizations just
Yeah,
for another round here, because Brian said earlier, wouldn't it be great if we could start with the board of directors and have a modeling of the ethics that a dialogic relationship at work could represent? And Glenna, I'm wondering what kind of experiences you've had working at different levels of the organization, um, and you know, do you commonly find openness at the highest levels of an organization? And what do you think gets in the way if not?
You read my mind, Boaz.
I have I have limited experience working at the upper levels of organizations. Um, it's not a place that I have had a lot of access to. Um, and so more of my experience is probably working with like departments within large organizations, or the work we did, Boaz, right, a few years ago. That's the top of a small organization within a much larger organization. Um, so, but that was an example of where, there was, where the leader could make choices, could make decisions, that might not have been able to be made lower down, and of bringing in, people, a select group of people. Um, so I think it's always more, well, I don't know if is that true? I've worked with a couple of boards in foundations, and not for profits. And I think that potentially that is the highest leverage place to go, simply because you're working in a hierarchy and they're at the top of the hierarchy. Um, and so they can take something down where people in the middle may not be able to influence anything moving up. We tend to be able to influence what's beneath us in the hierarchy, in terms of decision making, that kind of thing, and use of resources. And I think both of those are really important. Um, but the same dynamics exist. So when I did work with the board, when I worked with the board of the Fetzer Institute, we worked with the board, and then we actually worked with the whole of the institute. And of course, that's not a huge organization, but the dialogue went throughout the organization. And for a couple of years, that was incredibly, powerful for that organization. And then, somebody new came in, and they I'm not sure. I think one of the patterns that is very powerful in interrupting this is when a new leader comes in, and for whatever reason, they almost always come in with a mandate that they're new and they're supposed to make a difference, either because something isn't working and they're supposed to fix it, which is one scenario, or it could be that everything's working, but this other person is left, and we want to know that we've made the right choice. So we want to see who you are. You know, you have to prove yourself to us. In other words, in both cases, whether it's like a neutral, positive, or negative, the leader always has to prove themselves. So it takes a very particular person to actually go to people that are already there and say, tell me what's working and how I can prove myself by helping you make everything even better, right? That's not generally what happens. um, so I think, and so that's one of the ways that systems get limited or limit themselves, or we limit ourselves because we buy into that organizational culture and that set of expectations. So so it takes an unusual leader, but they exist. I mean, they do exist. But they're not there. My experience is there's not a whole lot of them. And from one of the people that I do know who did all of her work in big organizations at the top, um, she spent a lot of time being very choosy about who she worked with. um, and she did it not just for herself, but also for the people in the organization, because she knew that there was either going to be like positive cascading down, or there was going to be backlash kind of stuff. And then not only would it be a waste of her time, but it actually could be detrimental to people, because, it's like when you go in and you introduce something and people get a taste of it and they recognize the value, and then something happens where they get told, I'm sorry, we're not doing that. There's, it's hard. I still think it's of value to them personally, to every person who was there, because they had a different kind of experience and they know what's possible. So I think it's worth having done the work. And I also understand that it can be really kind of disruptive for some people.
You mean
It's
that in a negative sense, it sounds like.
what?
Disruptive in a
Yeah,
negative sense.
it can be difficult,
Uh-huh.
disruptive in a difficult way. So let me give a different example that's just an individual example, but I think it's the same kind of I don't know. I think we as people who come in from outside have some responsibility. So, for example, people would say to me often, you do these like intensive, introduction to dialogue things, and they were all in person. And they said that many number of people would ask me, so what do you do, when somebody like falls apart? Um, and I said, I have actually never had that experience. And it's not because people don't go to places that are really risky for them. I mean, I attribute it to the fact that when I set up work, especially intense work with people in person, I talk to people about paying attention. If this feels scary to you, but it feels like something where you can push it and you'll be okay, you'll be able to take care of yourself, you might want somebody to pat you on the shoulder, but other than that, you're going to be okay. Go for it. But if you feel like you're not sure, or no, it feels like you're really getting pushed, don't do it. So take the responsibility and really let people know that that's good. That that giving into pressure to belong is not good. And then I also talk to the group, because it's so possible for groups to put pressure on people to go where they really shouldn't go. And they can do it without ever even knowing that they're doing it. So by really working with that, I think it helps create a place that's safe, so people don't end up falling apart and not being able to put it back together, right? Which is, I think if people get disrupted and they have the tools to deal with it, and I can be a little bit helpful, but that's not my profession, then that can be good. They can make use of that disruption for really in-depth learning for themselves. But just getting super disrupted just to know, that it feels dangerous. And I think there are times when there can be individuals in an organization who might get disrupted in a way by backlash with things changing, or a leader saying, oh, you thought you had the great, I mean, they don't say this, but the action is like, wow, they had this wonderful environment that they suddenly discovered, and they're feeling like different than they have for a long time. And then somebody puts their foot down on top of it. And depending upon the integrity of that person, I mean, inner integrity, not their values, depending upon that integrity, that could be pretty distressing. And I would not want to see that kind of thing happen. So I think about that kind of stuff, when I don't do it anymore, because I don't do that work anymore, pretty much, just occasionally. But I thought about that a lot when I was working in organizations. Yeah.
Thanks
So.
for following that thread. It seems to me that maybe we reinforce the leadership personas of leaders needing to know what's right and knowing how to
Mm-hmm.
do what needs to be done, and outsourcing kind of like the vision, the North Star to them, and and that concretizes them in a sort of in a trap where they
Mm-hmm.
can't learn, they can't take a dialogic view because
Mm-hmm.
they're supposed to know already, and
Yeah.
that's really unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah. We do. We do that. I mean, we
yeah.
put our leaders in boxes, and part of it, I do think in our culture, part of it is because we don't want to accept responsibility.
Mm.
Unfortunately, I think we want somebody else to, take care of it for us, you know. So I'm not going to go much further with that one, but I, yeah,
We'll see.
yeah.
Because my next question for you, Glenna, is, I mean, dialogue is really integrated into your life, and we mentioned work-life balance before. At least that's my impression, that you are identified with this work in some way, and so I'm curious how it informs how you live, how because dialogue isn't just a practice. I think it's also a philosophy. I think it's also an ethics. I think it's also um, a way of being in the world, and you're the person that I know that represents that in some way. I'm not saying
Mm,
that's all you are by any
right.
stretch, but I'm curious about how dialogue and how you live have kind of grown together.
Well, in some sense, it's kind of like a cosmology. I mean, in a way, because it's one of the ways I make sense of the world, the kind of practical, down to earth world. And so I think one of the ways it affects my life is that I work really hard to hold the whole and to not take sides. Um, which doesn't mean that I don't. I do, right? I mean, but I recognize the value of, um, for me, of holding the whole. And so, for example, in our country now, with all the division that's present in our country, and it's been here for lots of years. It's gotten more dramatic, I think because of some of the people involved, but it's been here for quite some time. That division, I try. I try really hard to remind myself that no matter which side you appreciate more, um, people on both sides have realities and truths that are important to them. And there's a reason why, they take the side that they take. And part of my job is to try to understand that rather than fight against it. So I hold activism, for example, in a very particular way. I'm not going to join an activist group that is going to get violent, call people names, that sort of thing, because I think all that does is reinforce the exact same divisiveness that exists. Now, are there times when I want to? Yes, absolutely. um, so, I recognize, I think the other thing that is very true for me is I'm very aware of all the assumptions that are running around, inside of me. And I know that there are aspects of the larger culture that I grew up in and that's in the air that I breathe that come out of my mouth all the time. And they also dictate how I feel about something, so what I do is try to be aware of them. I don't expect them to not be there, but I try to learn to witness them. And of course, when I get emotionally upset, I try to give myself a space to calm down because I know that when I'm emotionally upset, I'm a bitch. All those kind of negative patterns can come to the foreground um, because the emotions and the chemistry kind of open the door for that. So it doesn't mean I don't want to be emotional because I don't believe in that. I believe emotions are a very important aspect of who we are. But I also know that the stress responses in our bodies, kind of open the door for stuff to come out that can be really harmful. So, yeah, so that's a little bit of it. Um, yeah.
Thanks. And what's interesting for you these days? What are you thinking about? What are you working on? What's your what's unfolding for you?
What I find myself putting more and more energy into is just looking for opportunities to explore what are different people doing with dialogue and not just listen to what they're saying, but if I get invited to a group, go and be in it and practice what they're practicing and see what is that, what's because it's like this, prism with all these different facets. um, and so I almost never see a form of I don't think I've seen one. I don't think I've seen a form of dialogue that I don't think has value. I think there are many forms that are missing the metacognitive component, which for me is critical. Um, but that doesn't mean they're not valuable. It doesn't mean they're not doing great work around relationships and, which feels incredibly important in our world with all the divisions that we do have. Because I think we have more of a tendency to be willing to overcome fragmentation with people that we care about. It doesn't mean it'll be easy. We see that in our personal relationships for sure, but we're motivated. So I think that work is also really, really important. So I'm also doing a lot more stuff that is just kind of pro bono. Our dialogue group, I love our dialogue group and the exploration that we're engaged with, the experiment that we're doing, about how could a group actually be a collective, actually be come in and help people versus a individual consultant kind of thing. So exploring that experiment has a lot of value for me. I'm I'm also working on a curriculum with a group of international people that are developing a curriculum for a university in Germany around global we consciousness that was
Mm.
motivated, came out of an interest of the leader around climate change and having global we consciousness being so necessary to even be able to think about climate change. Um, and so that's challenging because it's got scope creep that's crazy. But it's
Right.
also really engaging. It's I'm pushing my edges, which I which is a good thing. So I'm doing that. So I'm kind of looking for opportunities, to engage, but to do that in a way that supports people, in with dialogue, with as kind of the primary focus. Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
Um, Brian, is there anything remaining for you?
Uh, Not that leaps to mind, other than to encourage people to find out about David Bohm because, I mean,
Yeah,
seriously, this
yeah.
guy was one of a kind, and, no, I mean, I think that it really just to sort of sum it up, we started 60 some episodes ago, not really knowing where our dialogue would end up.
Mm, mhm,
And we've been through a lot of different areas and we've pulled a lot of references and sort of recapitulated a lot of the parts of Western thought. And we find ourselves ending up here with dialogue as a important thing, whether it's from Plato or
mhm,
from Levinas or any of those more modern settings. And so I feel like this is it's a conversation or a topic that's bubbling up on its own,
mm,
and I
mm.
have to think that it's doing so because it's apropos.
Yeah.
It is a time for this. I think that that's what David Bohm thought, if I
Mhm,
may be so bold, that we are in a place where now our understanding will enable us to understand fragmentation and our role in it and the
mhm,
price we pay for it
mhm,
and the idea that there is a pathway beyond it and that
mhm,
there's some universality to the directions that those folks, be it David Bohm or Krishnamurti or the Dalai Lama or
mhm,
that whole direction. I think that there is an interesting, I'm very invested in philosophy gluing everything back together again. Philosophy used to be everything was philosophy. There was
yeah.
no trying to understand the world that was not considered philosophy. We called science natural philosophy, and metaphysics was first philosophy. But so I feel like we're in a place where our philosophy makes a huge difference now, and how we think about the world and relate to it is huge. And we got to get smarter about it really quick, I think. And we need to use technology in a way that empowers that, which is what we're trying to do with Fools and Sages, as
Mhm,
opposed to confusing and obscure it. And so this has just been a beautiful natural piece of this, of our own unfolding of the implicate into the
mm,
explicate. So
mm.
no, it's been wonderful.
Cool. Thank you. Well, it's been lots
Yeah.
of fun.
Thank you.
So, which is that's another motto these days. If I can't have some fun doing it, even if it's still challenging, if it's not at all, does no fun, don't want to. So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
and I
So,
think it's
thank
been
you.
riveting. The
Yeah.
conversations we've had have just been really riveting to me, and so that's what keeps bringing me back to the whole dialogue
Yeah, I love
thing.
what the two of you are doing. Whenever I have a chance to listen, I'm always fascinated, and
Well,
always I don't know
you
if
definitely get
inspired.
a
They're
mug
they're
then.
evocative. They're evocative and sometimes provocative. Yeah,
Great. That's
Well, you
great.
yeah.
definitely get
So
a mug.
that's
Thank
right.
you,
Oh,
Glenna.
I definitely want a mug. So thank you both very much. Okay, be
Glenna,
well.
really appreciate it. I hope we can come back together at some point and do this again as we all continue our unfolding.
Yeah.
I feel like I learned about you today. I learned more about David Bohm today. I learned more about dialogue today, as I do every time we spend time together. So I'm really grateful for that, and look forward to seeing you soon.
That's great. Likewise. All right, you two. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.